What's going on, YouTube? Welcome back to the Modern Jack channel. This week I've had an opportunity to go on a bit of a road trip, and this was our first chance to actually take our Tesla out on this road trip. So I thought it'd be a good opportunity to talk about some of the questions that seem to come up all the time around electric vehicles. Now, most of the questions that come up around electric vehicles tend to be about the longer trips. Most people aren't really concerned about commuting day to day, which is really 95% of the time. But for purposes of the video, well, we'll go through what this trip was like. So just to give you a couple details around this trip, it's about 350 miles. We went to a location that was a little bit colder and at a higher elevation. So we saw a change in temperature from about 75 degrees down to 35 degrees. So it was an opportunity to look at some of the colder weather. And we saw an elevation change of about 6,000 feet. We also took a dog with us. We were in muddy conditions when we got there, and we got to test out some of the supercharging experiences. So overall, I thought it was a good opportunity to just talk through some of these concerns that people have around Teslas and just let you know how the experience was for me. Now, I'm not here to argue whether EVs are the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. Honestly, that's each person's opinion. But I can tell you about how my experience was driving this EV up north. If you're curious about driving a Tesla, charging it at a Tesla Supercharger, taking a dog with you with white interior seats, dealing with elevation changes, and dealing with temperature changes, well then stick around and I'll talk through some of the details related to this. So I thought I'd start by just putting together a couple clips along the trip. I broke the trip up into two halves on the way up and two halves on the way back, just to see how driving was and be able to take an opportunity to charge at one of the supercharging stations. So you'll notice in each of the legs is a little bit different. Some of it had more of an elevation, some of it had colder conditions, just little variations, and I just tried to track really what impacted the overall experience. Okay, so our trip looks like it's going to be about 140 miles there and about 2 hours to get there as well. So just looking at our current average across the whole lifetime of the car so far, we've got an average energy consumption of about 216 watt hours per mile. When I did the math on that, it comes out to about 265 or 266 miles of range on the battery, which is rated for 272 currently. So I'm actually going to split up this trip. I don't need to based on what it's telling me, but I'm going to split it into two parts on the trip and make a stop at one of the superchargers along the way. Where we're going is actually going to be a bit colder than where we're leaving from, so I want to see if there's a difference on the first half versus the second half in terms of the energy consumption. Okay, so we're at our first stop along the journey, about the halfway point, and I just recorded the trip for this part. It looks like our average energy consumption is around 351 watt hours per mile. So that actually comes out to about 167 miles of range, much lower than our typical 272. I tried to record this time. It looks like it's 62 degrees Fahrenheit right now, so it's not actually too cold at all yet. I think the main reason for the difference is we're going up in elevation. So we'll just have to see what the next half looks like. Okay, so we made it to our destination. Had about 40% left after charging up to 90%. It was about what we expected for the trip. But if you'll notice here, the average energy consumption for the second half of the trip was 340 watt hours per mile. This is a little bit better than the first half, so I think it has to do with some of the change in elevation. Again, we were actually going downhill for a portion of it and just regenerating some of the energy. So I think that's the difference there. We also didn't get to too cold of a temperature. Right now you can see it's 37 degrees, but I think at the end of the trip it was 40 degrees. So it wasn't really too cold, so we may try this on the way back or over the weekend. I think we're gonna hit some colder weather as we're here, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so we're on our trip back. We made it to our first stop, kind of the halfway point. If you'll notice, that's trip B on here. We're getting an average energy consumption of about 228 watt hours per mile, and you'll see above that it's pretty close to our overall average that we get for the car, so not a whole lot of impact on this. We'll say on this one we were on mostly a downward trajectory with the elevation. We did start the day at about 37 degrees Fahrenheit, so I'm not really seeing too much of an impact from the cold temperature on this. It seems like it's probably more from just some of the hills, but I can go over here and just look at the energy consumption for that trip as well. You can see in the bottom right, really, Speed impacted it the most, and then some wind, which is not surprising. And it says lower tire pressure, but I think that's just when we started the morning it was colder, so the PSI was lower, but you know, it really looks like it's back up to where it should be on that. You can see it's at roughly 41 or 42 PSI for most of the tires. So I'm not really seeing a whole lot from the cold, but we didn't get cold enough. So if you're ever wondering about the temperature range, I would say maybe below freezing will have an impact more so, but we went down to, you know, 35, 37 degrees, somewhere in there, and didn't really see too much of an impact from the cold. All right, finally made it back, and it looks like the last leg we got pretty good consumption, actually better than our average. So you can see we got it at 188 watt hours per mile in the last leg. Again, just kind of looking at the consumption. Obviously we were going a bit above 70 just with the speed limit here, but looks like climate did have some impact on this, definitely elevation. You know, I think those are probably the two big things. We're definitely going downhill a lot on the last leg, so it looks like really we couldn't do a whole lot about the climate on this trip, but elevation definitely played an impact for sure. So by the end of the trip, we had made a few stops at several Tesla Superchargers, and we made a final charge at home of about 75% of the battery. All in all, the charges totaled up to about $40 in spending. I did the math on this based on where we live. It's about $4.20 per gallon if we were to use gas, and our other vehicle gets pretty good gas mileage. We get about 30 miles to the gallon. So I did the math on that based on the about 350 miles of distance that we traveled. It would have been about $50 for the same trip in a gas-powered vehicle. So we had a savings of $10 even with some of the more expensive Tesla supercharging stations where we went. So just to recap those videos that we looked at, the main key impacts to the overall range of the Tesla were the elevation change, the temperature change, and really the speed that we were going at. Temperature-wise, honestly, we saw really minimal impact in terms of range just from what the Tesla was telling us and what we seemed to see. Now we only got down to about 35 degrees Fahrenheit, but I know at colder temperatures than that we can have some challenges. And I did seem to see a bit of an increased time required to charge at the supercharging station. The heat pump kicked on during that time, and it took more than an hour for our longest charge just to get up to full capacity. I think this is probably related to the temperature, but we were also at a location where there were a lot of other Teslas charging. As for the elevation change, this seemed to be the biggest impact. We definitely had a significant decrease in range on the way up as we were going pretty heavily uphill. Now on the way back down, it was a blast. Going downhill in that vehicle is awesome. It maneuvers really well, plus I got to watch the capacity actually increase as we went downhill. So we definitely got a lot of energy back on that. Now the Tesla always wants to recommend a speed under 70 miles per hour, but practically that just doesn't happen on some of these longer trips. We were in plenty of ranges where the speed limit was 75 and the flow of traffic was even above that. So I wouldn't say that following that is great, and I would just assume that on some of these longer trips you probably will lose some range just because of the speed. Alright, so how was supercharging at the Tesla Supercharger stations? Well, for us, it was pretty good. I would say that the prices were significantly higher. We were paying about 41 cents per kilowatt hour, whereas at home we get somewhere between 6.5 to 8 cents per kilowatt hour. So pretty big increase in price just to be able to use that. Now, practically, it was actually in our hotel parking lot, so we didn't have to go anywhere to charge. We literally charged the Tesla and then drove across that same parking spot area to just park for the night. It was great. It was fantastic. I could decide if I wanted to charge at night or charge in the morning, and that was awesome. As for locations, we were able to find plenty of stations when we needed it. We went pretty long distances at times. We did a day trip over to a different location which didn't have a supercharger. We were able to get there and back with no problem, and overall the supercharging experience was pretty good. So if you're curious about the overall drive of the vehicle, well, it was good and bad. So let's start with the good. As everyone will tell you, the speed and torque of a Tesla is amazing. I've done this trip before with other vehicles, and every time I go uphill, it's just a challenge to get up those hills, especially if you have to slow down and then speed up again. Just with the flow of traffic, it's pretty challenging. The Tesla lost no speed on it. It was easy to accelerate back up to whatever I needed, whenever I needed it. It was fantastic. Now, on the second half of our trip up there, we actually hit some rain, and honestly, the vehicle handled really well. Now remember, I've got the Tesla Model 3 rear-wheel drive, and it didn't miss a beat on wet roads. And we're in an area where it tends to get pretty oily at times, and honestly the Tesla just handled really well. I wouldn't be concerned about that at all. Maybe in heavier rain, but honestly I don't think it would have been much of a challenge. On the flip side though, I do have to talk about the stiff drive that it is. Now, it's fun in the city. I do enjoy the stiff drive just for the sportiness of it, but on these longer trips the seats just became pretty uncomfortable. I definitely had a stiff neck by the end of the first day, and I'm definitely going to be investing in a neck rest of some sort for the next trip that I go on. I did also use the autopilot for a portion of the trip up there. Now, this is just the adaptive cruise control and the lane assist, and honestly my biggest challenge was around the lane assist. Where we were going, there was construction on the road, some of the lines weren't exactly painted well, and there was just weird flows in traffic where people were cutting over at different times, and I just didn't really feel comfortable with the lane assist. It didn't seem to react and respond well to those two things on the road. I think there's still some work to be done there. I've always kind of thought that at this point, but it is still nice, and I definitely used it for some portion of the trip. So we did bring our fur baby on this trip as well, and he can be a bit of a handful when it comes to getting in and out of vehicles. He tends to just do what he wants. Now, when we got to our destination, it had been snowing and started to melt, so it was pretty muddy when we got there. We took the dog with us. He'd get out, try to jump back in, and we've got the white seats. Now, luckily we've got the Tesla Pet Liner, and I would honestly recommend it. It's held up really well. I thought it would be super dirty and difficult to clean when we got home, but I did a quick vacuum of it and it was back to brand new. As for the seats, they held up fine. He actually jumped straight into the front seat at one point and got some mud on there, but it just wiped right off with a baby wipe. No challenge at all. Honestly, I love the white seats. I would highly recommend them. I wouldn't worry about the upkeep on them. They seem to just handle everything really well. Overall, I'd say the experience was really great driving the Tesla. I didn't have any challenges. I would say there probably was a little bit of time added for supercharging, but when you charge at your destination and maybe make one stop along the way with these trips, it's just not really that noticeable. Now, I will say if we had driven a gas vehicle, we probably could have made it there and back on one tank of gas, no problem. So there would have been a little bit of extra time with the supercharger, but again, we just built it into the schedule. It wasn't a problem. The vehicle was great to drive. Honestly, it's better than any of the other vehicles I've driven before up there. And taking along a dog, taking along family, it was a little uncomfortable at times, but honestly, not that bad. It was really a good experience. So if you're concerned about anything else, feel free to leave a comment, ask me anything you want to know about it. I'll let you know what I've experienced with it, and if I haven't tried it out, I'll try to test something out to see how it goes for me. Thanks for listening in. Until next time.